Late last night and early today, at my direction, the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault. And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II.
On January 3, 2026, U.S. forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro in a high-risk operation that American officials have framed as law enforcement and national security, and critics have framed as something closer to regime change by raid. In the days that followed, the Trump administration did not behave like a government that had merely removed one isolated problem. It behaved like a government announcing a doctrine. U.S. forces began seizing sanctioned tankers linked to Venezuela, with the stated aim of controlling oil flows and rebuilding the sector under new terms, effectively extending the operation from a single decapitation strike into a broader campaign of leverage over an entire state's economic arteries. And then came the rhetorical crystallization, the label Monroe Doctrine, a Trump-era corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, increasingly used to describe a second-term foreign policy built around reasserting American predominance in the Western Hemisphere, while treating outside powers, above all China, as existential intruders in what Washington now calls our hemisphere. If you want to understand why the Maduro raid matters, the crucial move is to stop treating Venezuela as the story and start treating it as the demonstration.
There is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco-trafficker who is now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years.
The operation was not simply about Maduro, and it was never only about narcotics charges or the theater of toughness. It was the opening shot in a strategy designed to force a strategic choice across Latin America: align with the United States or absorb escalating costs for doing business with China. For 2 decades, China built a Latin America strategy that did not require fleets, bases, or formal alliances. It did something far more durable. It embedded itself into the region's logistics, energy, and resource extraction systems so deeply that decoupling becomes less a policy option than a structural shock. Trade numbers capture the arc. Two-way commerce between China and the Latin America, Caribbean bloc was roughly $12 billion at the start of this century. By 2024, it had exceeded $500 billion, a 40-fold leap that rewired incentives for governments and business elites across the hemisphere. This wasn't just a matter of buying soybeans and selling smartphones.
The U.S. military's Southern Command released footage on Wednesday showing what it said were American troops and helicopters seizing a tanker linked to Venezuela. The vessel, called Sofia, was one of 2 tankers seized on Wednesday. The other was a Russian-flagged ship nabbed near Iceland. The Marinera tanker had refused to be boarded last month and had switched to Russia's flag. A White House spokesperson said that the operation was aimed at enforcing sanctions on Venezuelan oil exports.
China pursued choke points, ports that compress distance, power lines that stabilize grids, minerals that feed the energy transition, and financing that arrives faster than U.S. programs ever did. Peru's port of Chancay is the emblem, a deep-water hub developed with China's state-linked shipping giant COSCO, tied to Belt and Road-era connectivity, pitched as a strategic gateway that cuts transit time from Peru to Asia from roughly 35 days to 23, lowering logistics costs and shifting trade gravity along the Pacific coast. On energy infrastructure, Chinese state grid has become one of the most consequential foreign actors in Brazil's transmission sector, winning landmark auctions and taking on major line builds, projects measured not in headlines but in kilometers of metal and rights-of-way that quietly determine where renewable power can flow and which regions can industrialize. And on critical minerals, the lithium triangle of Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile sits at the heart of the battery economy. Roughly 60% of identified lithium resources are in Latin America, making the region a strategic hinge for any serious industrial transition to EVs and grid storage. Washington's conclusion, spelled out with unusual bluntness in the Trump administration's 2025 national security strategy, is that the United States let its backyard drift into a competitor's supply chains and influence networks, and that drift now threatens U.S. security, prosperity, and leverage. The document does not merely revive the Monroe Doctrine as a historical reference. It explicitly calls for a Trump corollary that will reassert and enforce American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere and deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to own or control strategically vital assets in the region. It lays out the mechanism in language that is both strategic and coercive. Enlist regional partners to control migration and drug flows, expand U.S. access and presence, and make the terms of alliances and aid contingent on winding down outside influence over ports, infrastructure, and strategic assets. It also formalizes the economic toolbox, tariffs and reciprocal trade agreements described as powerful tools, and pairs it with a readiness to reshape military posture in the hemisphere, including targeted deployments, and, where deemed necessary, the use of lethal force in missions framed around cartels and border security. Read as a coherent whole, the strategy is not a polite request for Latin America to prefer American partnership. It is a plan to make neutrality expensive. It is an effort to convert the region's multi-alignment into binary alignment through a mix of inducements and penalties, finance and technology leverage on one hand, and the demonstrated willingness to use force on the other. That is why Maduro's capture is such a consequential signal. It tells every government in the hemisphere that Washington's restraint has changed. It tells leaders that the United States is prepared to act unilaterally in pursuit of hemispheric primacy, and that the cost of being labeled a hostile node in China's network may no longer be limited to diplomatic scolding or sanctions paperwork. Even if you believe the operation was justified on narrow legal grounds, strategy is not determined by legal briefs. It is determined by perception and precedent. Precedent is a language all capitals understand. Venezuela becomes the demonstration case, the day the United States showed, in the most visceral way, that it is willing to reach into a sovereign state and remove a leader it deems intolerable, then extend that action into a campaign to redirect oil flows and control maritime movement. And once that precedent is established, the doctrine begins to function as intended, not merely as policy, but as intimidation, a standing reminder that the hemisphere is being reordered and that some choices will trigger consequences faster than the region has grown accustomed to. The collision course emerges from one brutal constraint. China cannot simply leave Latin America without paying a strategic price. The region supplies a meaningful share of the commodity inputs that keep Chinese industry moving: iron ore, soy, copper, oil, while also offering new markets and political partners at a time of sharpening U.S. pressure elsewhere. China's response, therefore, is not likely to be retreat. It is likely to be adaptation. More financing, more trade integration, more diplomatic convening, and a louder narrative that the United States is returning to the hemisphere, not as partner, but as enforcer. At the China CELAC Forum in May 2025, Beijing leaned into exactly that posture, offering a multi-billion-dollar credit line and presenting itself as the steady alternative to what it portrayed as U.S. protectionism and coercion. The trend line is the point. As Washington tightens screws, Beijing looks for new bolts. Colombia's decision to sign a Belt and Road Cooperation Plan in 2025, one more marker of China's institutional foothold, signals how readily regional governments can diversify if they believe U.S. demands come with too many ultimatums. This is where the Monroe Doctrine stops being a slogan and becomes a trap. Because coercion is not a one-way weapon. It is a force that reorganizes incentives for everyone in the system. If Washington tells Latin America choose, it is also telling Beijing fight or accept strategic encirclement. If Beijing fights, it will not do so by sending tanks to Chile. It will do so the way it always has, by offering money with fewer lectures, by financing infrastructure that locks in trade routes, by building political coalitions that paint U.S. pressure as neo-imperial, and by using asymmetrical leverage, rare earth supply chains, consumer markets, investment flows, to raise the cost of American escalation. In other words, the hemispheric competition becomes a full-spectrum contest. ports and power grids, tariffs and credit lines, intelligence and influence operations, sanctions and counter-sanctions, with Latin American capitals squeezed between the need to attract investment and the need to avoid becoming the terrain on which great powers settle disputes. The irony is that Washington is attempting to win quickly in a region where China's advantage is time. The United States can threaten a tariff tomorrow. China can build a port that changes trade for 30 years. The United States can condition an IMF vote. China can finance a rail corridor and embed local elites in its supply chain. The United States can seize tankers. China can redirect purchases, deepen commodity reliance, and reward governments that resist. And because Latin America's political economy is not uniform, because Mexico's exposure differs from Brazil's autonomy, because Chile's mineral strategy differs from Colombia's trade structure, forcing a binary choice is not a clean exercise. It is a destabilizing one. It will create winners who cash in on alignment and losers who are punished for hedging. It will inflame domestic politics in countries where nationalism still treats U.S. pressure as an old story with a new costume. It will incentivize leaders to posture publicly, even if they compromise privately. It will make neutrality not just difficult, but dangerous. The fastest way to see the likely consequences is to watch how other players are already repositioning under the shadow of U.S. protectionism. Europe's decision in January 2026 to finalize a landmark free trade agreement with Mercosur was driven by multiple forces, but reporting has been explicit that Trump-era tariffs and trade tensions accelerated the push for diversification and strategic autonomy. That same impulse, diversify away from dependence, build alternative frameworks, will intensify in Latin America as the Doctrine hardens. Because once Washington's message becomes alignment is mandatory, every government begins quietly mapping out how to survive if Washington's favor becomes conditional, erratic, or transactional. And if those governments conclude they are being treated as subjects rather than partners, Beijing's investment without conditions pitch becomes more attractive, even for leaders who do not love China, because it offers the one thing coercion never can: room to maneuver. This is the great power collision course in 2026, not a single crisis, but a structural competition over the economic arteries of the Western Hemisphere. The Doctrine, as articulated in the National Security Strategy, is not merely about keeping adversaries from positioning forces in the hemisphere. It is about preventing them from owning the infrastructure that moves goods, powers cities, and extracts the minerals that define the next industrial era. That means the battleground is not only diplomatic, it is commercial and logistical. It is fought in port concessions and transmission line auctions, in mining contracts and telecom standards, in sanctions compliance departments and shipping insurance markets. When the United States shows it is willing to use force in Venezuela, it changes the risk calculus for every Chinese-linked project in the region. Suddenly, what looked like commercial integration looks like exposure. Beijing will not absorb that exposure passively. It will either harden its defenses through financial structures, political alliances, and retaliatory economic measures, or it will seek to raise the stakes elsewhere, in places where Washington has its own vulnerabilities. That is how great power competition metastasizes. One side asserts dominance in its perceived sphere. The other side responds in its own neighborhood. Each action becomes rhetorical justification for the next. And in the middle sits Latin America, which for 20 years benefited from the ability to play powers against each other. That era is ending. The Doctrine is designed to end it. It is designed to force a hemispheric sorting. Allies and adversaries, trusted partners and sanctioned intermediaries, dollar systems, and yuan credit lines. The tragedy is that when great powers force smaller states into binary choices, those states often pay the price first. Investment freezes, currency volatility, domestic polarization, coups by lawfare, street protests, and the quiet corrosion of sovereignty, as decisions are made not in parliaments, but in the shadow of external leverage. The Maduro raid is not the end of a story. It is the proof of concept for a new one. The only real question now is whether Washington's coercion can reverse 2 decades of Chinese integration before it triggers the backlash it fears most. A region that decides America's return home looks less like partnership and more like empire, and begins building its future around resistance rather than alignment. In 2026, the Western Hemisphere is no longer a quiet perimeter. It is becoming a front line. And once front lines form, they have a habit of expanding.
After capturing Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in an attack on Caracas on Saturday, the U.S. is continuing to blockade vessels under sanctions off the South American country. Trump has openly spoken of controlling Venezuela's vast oil reserves in conjunction with U.S. oil companies after arresting and jailing Maduro.